Welcome to RRS Virtual, Single-Use Plastics and Circular Economy Influencing Global Packaging Policy. I am Melissa Radwan, Director of Marketing for RRS, and I will be your technology host for today's webinar. I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. All attendees are muted. However, we do invite you to submit questions using the Q&A panel. Simply click the button at the bottom of your screen to open the Q&A panel and type in your questions anytime during the webinar. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Please do not put your questions in the chat box. Our panelists will not see those questions as they're going through. They're better organized under that Q&A panel. Finally, we are recording this webinar. We will post that recording to the RRS YouTube channel and share the link with all registrants probably early next week. So we want you to get involved during this event, and we've created several polls throughout, and it's easy to participate. Grab your mobile phone or open up another window in your web browser. If you're going to use your phone, you want to open up a new text message and type the message recycle123 and send it to the phone number 37607. That text will connect you to the polling system. When a poll appears, you simply text your answer to that same number and your response will be tallied with everyone's. If you're going to open up another window in your browser, don't close us, but open up another window and you're going to type the URL pollev.com/recycle123. So it's a website. It's going to connect you to that polling system. And when the poll appears on the slide that I show, you simply click or type the response in that window and we'll see your response. So what we're going to do is we're going to give it a try with an easy one to start with. So the first poll is using only one word. What are your feelings about COVID? We'll try to keep it clean, but negative. I think everyone would agree with that one. Sick, stifling, sad, frustrating. Maybe we need to come up with a better question that's a little more positive at the beginning. But this, everyone can participate. Everyone has an opinion about COVID. Misleading, frustrating, nervous, troubling, game-changing. Now there's a curious word, global. Hello. I do like the way you guys are participating. You got the hang of the polling system. So we're going to move ahead. Thank you for participating in that, and stay tuned. We have another one coming up right after Anne does her overview. I'm going to take a moment just to introduce all of our panelists. So what's going to happen is Anne will speak. She'll give a quick overview of global packaging policy. We'll have another poll. And then it's going to be a round table where we're talking, all our panelists are answering questions and discussing topics. Great conversation coming up. So let me start with introducing Anne Johnson. She is a principal and vice president at RRS and co-leads the Global Corporate Sustainability Service Sector. She has more than 25 years of multidisciplinary experience working with consumer product brands and manufacturers on sustainable product and packaging design and recovery, as well as corporate sustainability strategy and goal setting. She works on international solid waste and recycling issues in Europe, South America, and Asia, and was key in developing RRS TrueCycle, an assessment that analyzes product packaging recyclability or compostability. Her previous positions include founder and director of the Sustainable Packaging Coalition and consultant at McDonough Brownout Design Chemistry, which have added to her expertise in life cycle thinking, packaging, and sustainable materials management. Welcome, Anne. Thanks for joining us. Next, I want to introduce you to Ursula Denison. She is the Director of Sales and International Strategy and Marketing of Der Grüne Punkt, Germany. I hope I pronounced that right. Good, awesome. She ensures that the company's almost 30,000 customers all over the world receive the best possible customer service. Ursula has been with the pioneering German Green Dot system for packaging recycling at Duales System Deutschland GmbH, also known as DSD, from its very beginning in 1991. She has since then led several strategic projects with DSD involving EPR fee structure, international EPR strategy, eco-design for packaging, and development of high-quality post-consumer recyclates. She is a frequent speaker on the pioneering Green Dot system for international stakeholders in Europe, Asia, North and South America. Matching her international orientation, she has been actively involved with Pro-Europe, the European Association of 31 Green Dot packaging recovering organizations since 2007, and is leading the organization as managing director since 2013. Welcome, Ursula. Next up, I'd like to introduce Garth Hickle. Garth is an independent consultant with an emphasis on environmental product policy and the circular economy. Previously, he led the product stewardship program for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. He is also a senior lecturer and visiting scholar at the University of Minnesota. He currently serves as a board member of the Sustainable Electronics Recycling International and the STEP Initiative. Garth holds an MSEL from Vermont Law School and a PhD in Industrial Ecology and Sustainability from Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. Welcome, Garth. Finally, last but not least, Resa Dimino joined RRS in January of 2017 as a senior consultant, bringing over 25 years of experience in waste reduction, recycling, product stewardship, solid waste management, and environmental economic development. Prior to RRS, Resa served as Director of Policy for the National Association of PET Container Resources, also known as NAPCOR, the trade association for the PET packaging industry, where she worked to advance PET recovery and rPET markets. In earlier work experience, she was the lead policy staff for New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, leading development of the Beyond Waste Plan and e-scrap EPR legislation. Resa is currently focusing on corporate clients and collaborative initiatives to improve recovery, increase sustainability, and facilitate product stewardship. So welcome to all of our panelists. That was a lot to take in. So I'm going to turn it over to Anne. She is going to give us an overview of packaging policy, and then she's going to moderate the roundtable. Anne, I'm going to hand it over.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. And good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. To start off this conversation, we wanted to just give a bit of context about some of the sort of key issues that are influencing policy. So let's go to the next slide, Melissa, and we'll get into it. So some of this information will no doubt be familiar to you all, but I think this is really, it's important to just sort of lay the landscape of what's on people's minds, what's influencing action. So to start with, National Sword, which hit the stage in 2018, has had a really profound impact on basically every market, but in different ways. And I think one of the really important things is that what China started as a ban of scrap imports has grown well beyond China. So many other markets that had been recipients of scrap from the US and EU and other developed countries have definitely rethought their programs and their ability to take in material. And that's having a huge influence on local systems. And it varies, though. It certainly varies by market. I think in the US, we've really seen it sharpen focus on the need to improve our domestic systems, everything from end market development, infrastructure improvements, and certainly education on what we should be putting in our bins to recycle. Next slide, Melissa. Oops. There we go, thanks. And then obviously something that everybody is very familiar with, but I think is having an immense influence on perceptions around plastic and plastic recycling is the circular economy, which has really emerged as a new sort of language around sustainability. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation is certainly playing a foundational and central role in this. And I think that it's created a shared vision across a really broad set of stakeholders. And that's had some, I think, interesting consequences. The new plastic economy platform has driven a lot of action, some of it voluntary in the form of commitments from companies, around their packaging to design packaging that's reusable, recyclable, or compostable. But at the same time, it is driving a lot of awareness on the gaps between those commitments and the ability of our systems to support those in terms of adequate supply, quality of supply, things like that. So what we've also seen is policymakers picking up a lot of these concepts and putting goals, targets, and actions around them, and not just policymakers, but others. So let's go to the next slide. So I think one of the red hot nerve issues for plastics is certainly ocean plastics. And as the data has really emerged since Jenna Jambeck's sort of paper in 2015, I think there's broad recognition that there is a global waste crisis. We might not have been as aware of it before as we are now, but these waste crises definitely link to ocean plastics in a very substantial way. But not only are we experiencing this today, but as we look forward, we see that in emerging markets and really around the globe, waste generation is set to grow by 70% by 2050, according to the World Bank. And it's going to grow fastest in areas with the weakest waste management and recycling infrastructures. Many of these regions also overlay with places that are very geographically vulnerable to climate change, and we are already seeing some of those impacts. And one of those is increased storms and flooding. When you don't have well-managed waste or well-captured waste, the ability for it to mobilize is large. And so, there's a lot of urgency, I think, globally on how do we deal with both these infrastructure issues as well as, the consequences in the environment from climate change and obviously ocean plastics. So next slide, Melissa. So I think that it's become very clear that we have a long way to go to achieve the sort of vision of circularity for plastics. And there are many reasons for that. Part of it has to do with, the recycling infrastructure is only well developed for some resin types. Plastics tend to be very low value in some cases, which creates, lack of incentive to collect them for recycling. But I think that, this sort of iconic image from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation shows that, performance in terms of circularity, we have a lot of ground to cover to build out that system. And at the same time, we're seeing very high leakage rates into the environment. So we really have to be working on both those issues in order to create that circular vision for plastics. And this is not escaping regulators. They are certainly taking notice, and their response is growing across the globe. Next slide. So what types of policies are we seeing? We wanted to make sure that we had some sort of, a sense of how it's been growing over time. And we're really fortunate to have Ursula here because she's really been on the ground floor of EPR for packaging. And as you can see, in the early 2000s, it was pretty much limited to Western Europe. And over the last 20 years, we've seen really a tremendous growth in the adoption of EPR in different ways, in voluntary ways, in voluntary compliance. And we see new geographies starting to adopt framework legislation for it. In some cases, they have a long path to go to understand what implementation is going to look like. In other cases, we're seeing, places that have adopted it and are well on their way towards implementing it. But EPR certainly seems to be a policy platform that has been growing. I think we can talk to our panelists about what the future looks like. Next slide. And really, since I would say, a lot of the data has come out around ocean plastics and where we see real challenges. The growth in what we're calling single-use plastic regulation has really grown. This is a snapshot from a UN report just showing growth over time. And Jenna Jambeck's report came out in 2015, and you can see that from that moment, there's been an immense escalation in single-use plastic policies. Many countries are adopting ban bags, but at the same time, we're seeing different types of single-use broader bans really directed towards things like straws, stirs, that really have a very short life. And it's not just developed countries that are taking action. We also see this happening in emerging economies and certainly in Asia. So next slide. I wanted to just briefly go through what it has looked like in the U.S. And as you can see, this is sort of a, I didn't want to put it all out at once, but this really shows you the layering of policies that have been developing across the U.S. Ban bags have been, being implemented for some time, really prior to, I think, a lot of the focus on ocean plastics, but we've seen a significant increase in the U.S. in not only state-level bag bans, but also local bag bans, sorry. And I didn't want to put local issues on this because it would have been almost unreadable. But at the same time, we're seeing sort of a new category of policies around single use that are coming out. And they relate very tightly to bag bans and also EPS bans, which also have a long history in the U.S. But since I think there's been greater awareness around mismanaged plastics, we've seen growth in EPS bans. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight that we do see some momentum developing around EPR. We have 2 states currently that have study bills. So I think that's going to be an interesting area for us to explore in our discussion today. So I wanted to end with, can you go to the next slide? Just a sense of what are the types of common policies we're seeing. They range, really broadly. Where they're being implemented really is, quite different. So this is just sort of a laundry list of the things that are often being considered. And with that, let's turn it over to our discussion.
Okay, well, before we jump too far to the discussion, we wanted to take the temperature of the room when it comes to the state of recycling in the U.S. We have quite a number of options here, but what policy actions should be taken to advance recycling, especially when we're thinking about plastics? If you're using your phone, you can text the letter A, B, C, D, E, F, whichever one. And if you are on your web browser, you can click on the option that you believe should be taken. And if we look, it looks like Pay As You Throw is taking an early lead. Excuse me. Oh, container deposits has popped up. EPR is jumping into to take over. All right. So it looks like Pay As You Throw, EPR, and container deposits seem to be at the forefront of our audience minds on actions that could be taken in regards to the U.S. and in regards to plastics. So now I will hand it back over to Anne and the panelists, and you all can start your roundtable.
Great. I just want to apologize. There's somebody who I accidentally deleted their question, and I just wanted to clarify on that graphic I showed where 32% of plastics are released to the environment. That's an Ellen MacArthur Foundation graphic, and that is an annual estimate, I believe. So it's not of all plastics. All right, so let's get started. So I wanted to just, start off with a general question for you all to give us some perspective on what do you think are the most important policy instruments that governments are currently using to combat plastic waste and drive circularity. And, I thought we could start off with Ursula and her sort of European experience.
Yeah, sure. Hello to everybody. In Europe, extended producer responsibility, EPR, has really been the recipe for success, even though some would argue that it hasn't been all that successful. That's an approach, basically the polluter pays, so industry is obliged to pay for the recycling or waste management of the products and packaging they put on the market. More and more as time progresses and the results of EPR are not quite as satisfying as some politicians would like them to be, or other stakeholders, more punitive measures are coming into discussion. That's, for example, plastic taxes. There's a strong discussion on that on the European level and on the national level. And also straight out bans on certain plastic products. So that's quite an an active involvement in market mechanisms on the part of especially the EU Commission that has gained a lot of speed in the last couple of years.
Great, thank you. Resa, I was wondering if you could give your perspective on that question with regard to the U.S.
Sure. So I think policy in the U.S. is really focused on requiring that recycling services be provided. So that's mandatory recycling and also incentivizing participation. So mandatory recycling can take the form of requiring local governments to provide programs, requiring service providers who provide waste service to provide recycling service, those sorts of things. And we've seen a number of models throughout the US that have been successful in ensuring that residents have access to recycling, make it as easy to recycle it as it is to throw things away. That's important. And then you want to incentivize people to participate. And so you can do that through pay as you throw. That's a disincentive. You pay more if you waste more. You can provide an incentive to recycle, like the deposit programs, things like that. And you can also provide, create disposal bans and things like that that drive participation in recycling for the materials that are targeted. The challenge in the US is that there's a cost to providing these programs. And so the approach we've taken to increase access and provide certain incentives or disincentives to participation creates a cost, and it begs the question of who pays, which is part of what's driving the discussion in the US now around EPR. Should residents be required to pay? Should municipal local governments be required to pay? And things of that nature.
Great, thank you. So Garth, I'm going to throw that question to you to rest of world. What sort of policy instruments are most common when you look at sort of globally being used for this?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Well, I think that it falls into several different buckets. One is established EPR programs similar to what Ursula referenced for the EU. So for instance, most of the provinces in Canada, as well as Japan and so forth, have long established EPR programs. Secondly, are the nations that are in the implementation phase of EPR policy that has been enacted. Chile is probably a prime example of that. And then there's the next level, which is those countries would actually do have an EPR framework, but have not taken steps to implement that. And so Vietnam and Indonesia kind of fall into that category. And then lastly are those countries that have not addressed EPR, but have implemented taxes or fees for particular single-use plastics. Now, having said that, I think a lot of the EPR programs, as Ursula referenced, may have not been terribly effective about addressing or accepting single-use plastics. We're now starting to see a lot of revisions and expansions of those products, or those programs, excuse me, to actually accept some of those more challenging single-use plastic products.
Great, thank you for that. So one of the questions that has come up around EPR, and certainly in some of our preparation for this conversation, is a strategy called EcoModulation. And I want to thank one of the attendees for asking us to explain that EPR is extended producer responsibility and PPP is packaging and paper products. So sorry for the acronyms. But I wanted to just ask, Resa, what is the role of EcoModulation and what does it do?
Sure. So EcoModulation is a tool that can be used in EPR programs and other programs that are fee-based. And it's essentially a strategy for incentivizing packaging that is easier to recover or performs better in the stream, or it has better environmental performance through a bonus or a benefit in the fee structure, and disincentivizing or penalizing products or packages that are problematic in the stream, either non-recoverable or more difficult to recover or are disruptors in the system. And so it's a really growing idea and tool that's now being put in use in multiple places or starting to be talked about. Although the only current experience is in France, where it's broadly used on a variety of metrics, has had some really positive impacts in the initial implementation in France. So it's going to be interesting to see, as that approach is used more broadly across EPR programs, if the impacts become greater and more significant. Presumably, the broader the market the EcoModulation is applied to, the more impactful it will be. And so we're really looking forward to seeing, as this concept expands, how consistent the approaches are and if it really drives the kind of change we want to see. But the initial results in France have been very, very promising.
Let's turn that question to Ursula and just say, what do you see on the horizon in the EU with regard to EcoModulation? You know, what countries are looking at it or about to implement it, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, going back over 3 decades of living EPR in Germany, we've always eco-modulated. Plastic packaging has always been more expensive, for example, than paper packaging or metal packaging, because we try to integrate the cost of the end-of-life management into the license fees. But that hasn't gone far enough. So what we're doing now is a second stage of sophistication. And yes, the French have gone ahead, and being French, they have a very centralist, very dirigistical approach. We always say you have to be careful. You know, you could say, okay, let's do an LCA for every packaging on the market to really assess the complete environmental impact of that packaging and product. We all know that that is much too complicated. So the thing that we focus on in Germany and most other countries is the issue of recyclability. Is a packaging highly recyclable in the given infrastructure with the material composition that it's made from? And are you able to differentiate sufficiently, giving a bonus for highly recyclable packaging, so to incentivize producers changing their packaging towards higher recyclability? And we all know there are trade-offs. You know, there's the issue of lightweighting. If I look at my packaging, let's say it has to be flexible, it has to be light, it has to be safe. I mean, the whole Corona discussion showed us that, you know, plastics had a new image hype because plastics is safe and hygienic. So those are all issues that move us along right now, and it's basically every country in the EU. And what we're hoping for is some harmonization, at least in this internal market that the EU is supposed to be, so that we incentivize the same aspects and punish, quote unquote, problematic packaging, and not have a national approach, the French going this way and the Germans going this way, and the Brits a whole other direction.
So just to be clear, you see EcoModulation as being adopted by across the EU?
I think so. I mean, it's a natural progression of EPR, and we have EPR all over the EU with a couple of exceptions. But if you look at the highly ambitious recycling targets that apply to the interior or to the common market by 2030, the only way to achieve those targets is to significantly improve the recyclability of packaging. That means, on the one hand, investing in infrastructure to deal with packaging that is currently not recycled, that costs money, and changing highly problematic complex packaging to be better recyclable in the infrastructure that exists through giving a bonus for recyclability.
Right. So Garth, I just would like maybe a quick perspective from you on, as we see the spread of extended producer responsibility to emerging markets, and my understanding is Chile is just about to sort of implement their program, and they're also considering EcoModulation. Are there some unique challenges to implementing EPR in markets that are emerging markets or markets that don't have a long history of recycling and really sort of waste policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. There absolutely are. And a lot of those markets do have a history of recycling, but it's been largely dominated by the informal sector. And so that's one of the key issues that's at play, not only for packaging, but for all of the waste streams that are under consideration for EPR, is how to actually integrate that population of waste pickers, informal sector, which often goes just simply beyond collection, but actually down the processing change into these formalized systems. I think Latin America, in my opinion, has really taken a leadership role in terms of actually identifying how that integration could work. India's in the process of doing that for their electronics EPR efforts, but it's a significant disruption for how these systems have unfolded over the last several decades. So, again, it's kind of obviously a work in progress, but I think that is kind of the most notable issue at play at a lot of those developing countries.
Great, thanks for that. So Resa, I wanted to just turn to you quickly that I know you've been pretty engaged in this, that there are several states in the U.S. that are thinking about EPR. We have 2 states with study bills. I was wondering if you could just mention, what states are thinking about EPR, and what is there a difference in how they're thinking about it in the kinds of programs they'd be considering?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of interest, and I would expect 2021 to be a really busy legislative year for recycling generally and for EPR specifically. And where we're seeing a lot of interest and discussion around EPR is particularly in the Northeast and in the Northwest. These are typically regions that have mandatory recycling in place, that have a strong recycling ethic or recycling culture, and have been particularly hard hit by the cost increases in recycling over the last few years. So you have here communities that are now paying twice as much to recycle as they are to dispose of waste, sometimes even more than that, facing increases, just very significant financial increases where we're estimating, I think, more than $60 million in costs in New York, not including New York City, for example. So these costs are going up. People want to keep their recycling programs. They want to grow their recycling programs, and we need a way to do that and to find the financing to do that. And EPR has proven in a lot of other jurisdictions to provide stable financing and to provide an increase in recycling and improved performance. And so that's really what's driving that interest. So I think, states like New York, states like Oregon, states like Washington, Maine, obviously, and other states in New England are looking at this approach as we go into next year.
Great, thank you. So a question has come in I just wanted to share with you about, can companies readily achieve their stated 2025 goals of 100% reusable, recyclable, or compostable? Where will they get the required PCR from? And where will the capital investments to support the required infrastructure come from? So big, broad question. Thank you, Alan. And I think that this links to a bunch of things. So Resa, would you like to just, take a crack at responding to that with a North American perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think the goals are really laudable and important, but I think we are very far from figuring out how we get there. And I think the biggest problems are really economic. Yeah, I think that, we don't have the resources in the system right now to generate the supply necessary to generate the PCR, to develop the infrastructure necessary to process collected plastics into a material that can be used to make something else. I mean, it's important to point out that we have very advanced and reliable systems for recovering PET and HDPE, materials that we've been recovering for 30 years. We have very high recovery rates for PET in deposit states. We know how to get this material back and turn it into something valuable, but the resources aren't in the system right now to collect that material and to invest in the processing. I think there's some promising initiatives out there. The Recycling Partnership, the Closed Loop Fund are doing good work in moving things in that direction, but we have a really long way to go.
What's the situation in the EU, Ursula?
Well, I think EPR is a great, as Resa said, EPR is a great platform for financing. And I think there was another question. Recycling is always going to be more expensive than landfilling because landfilling isn't charged at the correct price. So with EPR, we create an artificial market. We make packaging more expensive, and the extra funds are used to recycle or process those materials. And I think that's an approach that that is worthwhile. I think it's always a question with EPR. You see the fees and you see the cost. You can have a balance sheet and sum it up. And with normal waste management fees levied by the municipalities, you never see the total cost of not recycling. That's an issue we have to deal with more and more.
So, so Ursula, in terms of the commitments and goals people have for recycled content, is there the similar situation where there's a significant gap between supply and demand? And are there any particular policies or strategies that are being adopted to try to address that?
Yes, that's one of the big obstacles that we face. There is never enough sufficiently qualitative material on the markets for big brands to switch whole lines of packaging to recycled content. So we have tried to, as Green Dot, we have recycling plants that we operate ourselves. And the thing is, if you only want white or natural HDPE recyclate, there's not that much of it, So again, either you have to pay a higher price, or you have to be willing to also take some gray material in order to create that market. But it's again, we now, as much as we love industry-driven and managed programs, we are actually petitioning the government to put a minimum recycled content regulation out there, because otherwise we're not gonna grow that market for post-consumer recycling.
Yeah, I'd like to just build on that a little bit. I think that there's a supply-demand imbalance in that there's not enough supply, and then there's also the supply-demand imbalance that the demand we have is not for the supply we're creating. So we are generating materials into the stream for which there are not strong and valuable markets. And so the items that have strong demand are few and far between, and a lot of the material we're generating is still really low value. So there's that imbalance of what we're the supply we're creating and the demand we have, as well as just the quantity issue.
Great. So I just want to, Garth, I want your perspective on this, because I'm wondering, you know, we have seen global trade in scrap plastics. It has been seriously limited, you know, recently in terms of exports from developed countries to emerging markets. But what role do emerging markets have in helping to address this supply balance, you know, for recycled content?
Yeah, well, I think that this kind of moves beyond just simply a question of waste management and the particular policy choices associated with recycling and waste issues to actually, and this really opens up that broader circular economy question and moves us into industrial policy. And I think for me that it's really gonna take kind of a substantial reframing of how national economic development policy is created and implemented if we're really going to see some change in this direction. And obviously what's going on in terms of climate and concern around carbon and so forth very much plays into that. But I think that we really do need to start kind of that broader kind of circular economy discussion for across a whole range of different materials, and really trying to embed that into the economic development strategies that are in place around the world.
Oh, interesting. Very interesting. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you all is, what, if any, role do you think advanced recycling technologies like pyrolysis, depolymerization, or purification have in complementing mechanical recycling streams? Because this is obviously a big area, they require large volumes of supply, and they also seem to be able to handle some of the you know, lower value, dirtier types of materials. And so I was wondering, Resa, how do you think that fits in the U.S. or doesn't fit?
Well, I think the technologies are really promising for the reasons you mentioned, because they're able to take materials that are typically lower quality, lower value, and move those into a higher end application. So I think they're really promising and important on the one hand. On the other hand, the economics are really challenging. And so they do require large volumes of material. It does cost money to collect large volumes of material and get them to the point where they can be processed by an advanced recycler. So again, we're back in the situation of where are the resources going to come from to collect and process this material to the point where it can be moved through an advanced recycling technology. So super promising. Big economic challenges, I think.
Thanks. How about Ursula? How about, you know, in the EU? How do you see its role?
You were talking about complementing. I mean, we call it chemical recycling as an overarching term. As a complement to material recycling targets, yes, not as a substitution. We still are looking for the proof of concept, the economics, Resa already mentioned, and the time frame until this is ready to go and really working is probably 3 to 5 years. In that time, we should not stop continuing to improve mechanical recycling technology because we have to reach those targets in 2025, 2030. We just don't have the time to sit back, and that's the danger I see. You know, there's this huge Deus Ex Machina coming from the sky. It's chemical recycling is going to solve literally all our problems. Let's not wait for that. Let's keep on moving in you know, high-tech material recycling applications.
Great. So I'm gonna move to some of the questions in the Q&A. So there's a question around, in the U.S., the cost of recycling is often quoted as the reason for not having substantial policies. What can be learned from other countries that have successfully implemented national policies to make such programs realistic in the U.S.? I guess I will, you know, I'll just open that to whomever on the panel would like to respond.
I would.
Okay, go ahead.
Again, it's a question of which costs are visible. And I had a quite surprising comparison if I look at what my recycling bin costs me in Germany. It's for a 4-person household. It's about, how much is it? 80 euros, which is $90 or something a year, okay? And I talked to my mother-in-law in Golden, Colorado, and she pays for a 1-person household a recycling fee of, I think, $14 a month. So that's significantly more. You know, I think it's hard to grasp the real cost if we have such different financing mechanisms. I don't think recycling is more expensive than landfilling, and if it is, it shouldn't be.
Resa or Garth? Are there any lessons you think that we can use in the U.S. from systems that have, you know, successfully implemented these policies?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to follow up on Ursula's observation. I do think that there are some significant costs that are embedded into the system in the US right now that aren't necessarily transparent or recognized. Just the sheer number of programs that are in place actually, I think, really inhibits and drives up costs in terms of having an overall well-performing system. And so regardless of whether EPR is implemented or not, I really do think that we need to take some significant steps towards collapsing the number of individual programs in the US, requiring collection of similar materials, and really supporting regionalization of recycling activities. I think EPR provides a good policy tool to help support that, but it's certainly not the only one. And so I think again, it's kind of reframing how we look at this from a local waste management issue to one that really is more premised on materials management, frankly.
I agree with all that, and I would just add, you know, sustainable financing is key, and resiliency in the system is also key. So policies that provide the ability to respond to things like dramatic market shifts, like we've seen in the last couple of years. Most U.S. states and programs don't have policies in place that really help, and sustainable financing in place that really help respond to those kinds of market changes.
So somebody was asking about, isn't recycling always going to cost more than landfill? And I think that really depends on geographies. But I wanted to just ask Ursula a question, because my understanding is that landfill bans are pretty universal in the EU, and that's almost like a foundational supporting policy position to build, you know, policies that then drive circular economy on top of it. And I just want to make sure, is that true or not?
They're not universal yet, but there are clear targets for introducing landfill bans, with just a few exceptions for like 10% of the waste volume. Germany has had a landfill ban since 2005, and there has no bigger boost to recycling than that, because you can't just dump it anymore. The alternative is either energetic recovery or recycling, and both are investment heavy. And with recycling, you at least get some materials back. You know, so I think that's a real strong point. But I mean, I've lived in Laramie, Wyoming, and if there's one thing, there's lots of room for dumping stuff. So I know the temptation is high to just let it disappear.
Resa, I just wanted to ask you, in the U.S., are there any models of landfill bans that have helped to support recycling?
Yeah, there's a great model. I mean, there are a number of landfill bans that have been put in place around the country. I think the most direct model in terms of packaging, and plastic packaging in particular, is North Carolina's plastic bottle disposal ban. I think it's really important to point out, though, that the disposal ban was used by the state as a tool and accompanied by a very significant investment in terms of education, outreach, and collection infrastructure. So they were able to say, look, you can't throw these in the trash anymore, but you need to recycle them. And here's where you recycle them. And for communities that didn't have that collection, the state helped provide the infrastructure to do that. So the landfill bans in the US context on their own, I don't think are necessarily a strong driver, but when coupled with education, outreach, and investment in infrastructure, they can be a very powerful part of the package.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I wanted to go to a question around technology. We've had a couple of questions come in around that, but I also, there's a question about the relationship between policy and technology innovation and how it might influence better plastic recovery. And Garth, I thought I might start off with you on what is that relationship between policy and technology innovation?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Well, I think that policy is really helpful because it's essentially an organizing principle around a particular product, particularly if there are quantitative dates and targets in place. I apologize for my dog in the background. And so that actually then helps channel investment and so forth in terms of being able to move forward and organize the overall system to marching in one direction. And I think that's really critical, and that's really what policy brings to the table.
Interesting. Ursula, I wanted to just turn to you and say, you know, are there smart technologies or other technologies that you think can sort of really, I don't know, catalyze the recovery of plastic? Are there any specific technologies you're seeing emerging that you'd be excited about?
Yeah, some of you probably have heard about the Holy Grail project. It's a multi-stakeholder platform for checking or for researching the digital watermarking of packaging so that it can be machine read in the sorting plants. Right now, we are sorting different types of plastics with near infrared technology that works. It has good results, but it is it has its limits, and this watermarking technology would basically make it possible to even pick out and separately sort the packaging of one specific brand and consumer, which of course, or producer, which of course would, you know, give great potential to bottle-to-bottle, bag-to-bag recycling technologies. We're not talking about price here, but it's fascinating technology. So that's something that people are excited about.
One question I have, and we're coming into time here, but I just wanted to ask you is, you know, what the EU Single-Use Plastics Directive, can you just share your thoughts on where you think that's likely to go, given that individual member states are going to have to implement it?
Well, it's going where the Commission wants it to go. And I keep telling my clients it took less than a year from the first draft of the directive to its implementation, and it's going to go into effect summer of next year. And it is full of surprises, you know, bans and basically as a collection target, for example, for plastic bottles of 90% by 2025, I think, which means obligatory deposit. So it's just one shot after another. Bans on certain products, bans on plastic bags and single-use beverage containers or cups. So it's very ambitious. It's gonna be implemented, and it has been a policy platform for the EU Commission that has made it very popular with especially young people in Europe. So it also has a great political relevance. It's not just, you know, boring tax policy or farm subsidies or something. It's something that that speaks to the hearts and minds of young Europeans and empowers the Commission to take drastic steps in influencing recycling and waste management policy all over Europe.
And we don't have time, but I wanted to ask you about the resource tax as well, whether there were any surprises behind that companies might expect. But I think I have to ask a closing question, so I might kind of lead with you on that one. I want to give everybody a chance to sort of share some closing thoughts. And I think one of the things is, you know, what are the most important issues that you think policy can address if we're going to move forward a circular economy for materials in general, but especially plastics? And Ursula, I'll lead off with you.
I think you have to put a value on plastics, and we all know that if we throw plastics away, it's not away, it will come back and haunt us. And if you give it a value, even an artificial value, through a plastic tax or through EPR or something like that, there is an incentive, and there is an economic incentive to get it back and to keep it in the materials loop, and I think that's the right way to go.
Great. Garth, what would you like to share on that question?
I certainly agree with Ursula, but I also think that policy would be really helpful in terms of actually really creating the infrastructure for the collection and recycling of plastics. When we think about the other material categories, whether it's metals, paper, so forth, a lot of those systems have been in place for a century or more in terms of being able to actually collect and reprocess those materials. So I think that we need to really focus on making sure that adequate collection opportunities are available, as well as sorting, processing, and then end use manufacturing and processing. So that's really what I'm kind of focused on, is actually being able to incentivize those systems.
Great, thanks. And Resa, why don't you wrap up for us and share your thoughts on that?
Sure, I agree with everything that Garth and Ursula have said, and I think in order to achieve those ends, we need a policy framework that provides sustainable financing, that provides a resilient approach, and a strong set of goals and targets and requirements in place to really move us forward. I would hate to see all of the energy that is right now around recycling policy lead to a cost shifting from one stakeholder to another and not actually achieve improvements in recycling, investments in infrastructure, and increased access to recycling. I think that would be tragic. So I'd like to make sure that we're focusing not only on sustainable financing, but also on creating a policy structure that allows for resilient, strong system moving forward.
Great, thank you. And thank all of you for participating today. Melissa, you want to wrap us up?
I sure will. So thank you to all of our panelists for providing great information. Audience, I have one more poll I've put up. We want to know, what do you want to know in the future? We host these webinars quite often. So what topics do we need to dig further into, or have we not touched upon yet? So go ahead and throw your topics into the poll. It's a short answer, so you can type multiple words. I see somebody has entered in more in-depth talk about the EU directive and the products that it will affect. As you're entering in those ideas, thank you to everyone that joined us today. Please be on the lookout for that link to today's recording. It will be up on the RRS YouTube channel early next week, but we're also going to email it out to everybody who registered today. this point, I am going to wrap us up. We're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much. I wish everyone a great rest of their day. Stay healthy and stay safe.